Okay, well, thank you again for joining the Hudson Valley Regional Council for its last webinar in the CARES Resilient Economy Lunch and Learn webinar series. Today, we will focus on crisis communications for economic recovery. My name is Carla Castillo, and I serve as HVRC's interim, soon to be full executive director. And I am joined by Lynn Knight, certified economic developer, and Cynthia Richmond, former deputy director for the economic development in Arlington and Loudoun counties, Virginia. Next slide, please. The Hudson Valley Regional Council is an organization of county governments established in 1977, comprising Dutchess, Orange, Putnam, Rockland, Sullivan, Ulster, and Westchester counties. It is one of 9 regional councils in the state and one of approximately 650 regional planning and development boards in the country that, in addition to providing a regional perspective, offer education and outreach, technical assistance, and advocacy to the communities they serve. HVRC delivers these services to its member counties as well as local governments and the over 2.3 million people who call the Mid-Hudson home through several federal and state grant programs around economic development, water quality, clean energy, climate smart, climate action planning, as well as regional platforms such as the Materials Management Working Group and the Mid-Hudson Regional Sustainability Coalition. Next slide, please. Our contributions to the region could not be accomplished without our many regional and state partners, some of which are shown here. Next slide, please. Today's final webinar in a 3-webinar series is part of HVRC's larger CARES project. The CARES project will present the impact of COVID-19 on the Mid-Hudson region's economy, as well as the region's learnings and best practice responses. The project will also outline national best practices to the pandemic, as well as provide best practice options for responding with resilience to future impacts on our economy. This work is funded by the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act through the Economic Development Administration. HVRC is grateful to our member counties and the largest population centers for their participation in the project and for the invaluable information shared. We ask that you post comments and questions in the chat throughout the presentation. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. Although health and safety always come first, a second priority for communities is to get businesses back up and running, people employed, and local revenues flowing after a crisis. Our presenters today, Lynn Knight and Cynthia Richmond, will discuss why it is so important that economic developers play a role in keeping businesses informed and communicating the back in business message. In addition to Lynn's work as a certified economic developer and manager of an economic recovery program, Lynn also served for 5 years as vice president of knowledge management for the International Economic Development Council. Lynn was also executive vice president of the Institute for Sustainable Development and has served on the Economic Development Board of Advisors for the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Lynn is the author or editor of more than 50 publications, most recently including States of Resilience, a study of state-level resiliency initiatives, Leadership in Times of Crisis Toolkit, and The Changing Energy Landscape and Its Impacts on Economic Development in America. Cindy, or Cynthia, has more than 30 years experience in local economic development, including business recruitment and retention, small business assistance, policy development, real estate development, and economic sustainability. Cindy served as deputy director for economic development in both Arlington and Loudoun counties in Virginia, and previously worked as a regional economist for Battelle Memorial Institute in Columbus, Ohio. Under Cindy's leadership, the counties received an award from the IADC for an innovative COVID grant program. Thank you, Lynn and Cindy, for joining us today. Take it away.
Thank you. Well, this is a topic that is something I have lived many times over. In my little bio, you might have seen that I used to have a PR and advertising agency for 14 years in a place that was disaster prone. And also I worked for an international firm at one time that was in 12 industries. And it seems like with all of our locations and the types of businesses we had, frequently, we would have crises. So I've had opportunity to practice what we're going to be preaching today, and we'll be telling stories throughout the presentation, as will Cindy. Next slide, please. I'm going to ask Cindy to take this topic and talk to us a little bit about why communications are such an essential element of recovering from a crisis.
So Lynn, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how economic development is critical to communications that happen during a crisis. And I really, as someone in the field for so long, we've had to deal with many crises in our community. So we haven't been ones that go to a crisis and help solve problems. These are things that have happened to us that we've had to work through and solve. And communications, as you know, are vital. And economic development is so well positioned to do, to contribute to this, and actually in some cases, and at some phases, to lead in the communications. Because one of the things that's really important is that people are looking towards the leaders in your community to help them figure out what's going on now, what's happening, and what does their future look like, and how can they help make the decisions, the everyday decisions they have to make based on what is going on. I do think that economic developers, when I was getting ready for this, I thought about this. Our normal work, which is trying to attract businesses to come into your community or expand in your community, they require much of the same kinds of qualities that you have to have in a crisis. Things happen very fast. You have to respond quickly. You have to hold confidentiality. You have to deal with leaders from all over, whether they are at the federal level, including the president, or whether they are leaders of small organizations or small business owners in your community. And in order to be able to do that, you have to have some relationships with them. You have to be able to have to build new relationships quickly. And part of that means they have to have confidence that you know what you're doing, and they have to trust you that you are after their best interests. So, clearly it's important that you provide information quickly, timely, and it needs to be accurate. So Lynn, that's what I have to say about this. Anything more you want me to add? I think you're muted.
Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. So, I've seen this a lot where local leaders are often judged on the timeliness and accuracy of information. I mean, how many times have you seen a community get mad when they don't feel like they're getting the right information, or things are being withheld from them? Especially when it's a serious weather situation or some imminent threat. They need information fast, not only to ensure that they're safe, but also so that, if you've got a business and you need to close certain things down and have time to get your employees home or even evacuate, you need very fast information. And then afterwards, you want to know, what areas might be closed, where their hazards are, and really what's the plan. One of the exciting things today is that we now have so many options to communicate. It used to just be the traditional media where you're working essentially through a reporter, and you have to trust that that reporter understands what you're going to say and that they won't misquote you, and you're really taking a chance. Communications messages change when they go through multiple people. Today, you can communicate directly with your audience through social media and cut out the middleman. That's not to say you don't want to use mainland media to get out your messages, but you really have the opportunity to communicate with your audience in real time. Next slide, please. So why are we talking about this? So the best crisis communications are planned during blue skies. We're not in a disaster situation in the Hudson Valley right now, and hopefully we won't be anytime in the near future. So now is a good time to really think things through, how we would communicate, who is going to be our spokesperson or spokespeople, and to start to get ourselves ready. You know, do we have all the information on how to reach our audiences, and you know, how can we leverage the private sector in that? Next slide, please. So, you know, during and after a disaster, local leaders have to make quick decisions, and they have a direct impact on business. As we've talked in the last webinar, we talked about having a business reentry program. You know, the first thing you want to do as soon as it's safe is to let your business back in, and you need to communicate that. And it's two-way street, giving them access to their property. If the power's out, they're going to need communication about restoration. If people are using generators, when to turn them on and off, and all, there's so much going on. It's very confusing. And eventually you're going to end up also communicating that your community is back open. You're going to be making decisions about infrastructure. And what we think as economic developers is it's very important to incorporate business and industry in all of those decisions and in the communications early. Would you agree with that, Cynthia?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, if you have relationships with, if you understand who's in your community and have relationships with key people in there, you can actually sort of multiply your ability to communicate by helping everybody understand what these key pieces are, how to get your business back open, when are things going to happen, and help them plan their own. I mean, they've got a million things to do to get back in and get their business open. And the more we can help them with that, the faster recovery will happen.
Next slide, please. So rumors spread fast, and they can not only lead to a slower economic recovery, but hamper it. It's partially about confidence, but also, you know, allaying fears. I mean, businesses may delay opening, or they may even move if they don't feel like they've gotten the right information or they're not confident. And we'll talk about that a bit more later. As economic developers, they may attempt to contact you for information. So you need to be ready. And how you communicate or don't communicate can have a big impact on how quickly they recover and whether you're going to retain businesses. So I would say, you know, as an economic developer, really what it all boils down to is you want to keep these businesses in your community. You need to keep their confidence. You want them to stay and reopen as soon as possible and get money flowing again and get people back employed. Next up, next slide, please. So here are some of the steps. You know, you could take them in any order, but really the first thing I would say is to figure out who is going to be your spokesperson, who's confident, articulate, takes direction, doesn't go off into tangents, that can be your spokesperson, and you may have more than one. Updating your contacts, we'll talk about that, but you know, trying to figure out who to call and how to reach them in the middle of a crisis is not where you want to be. You want to have those lists easily at hand. You want to establish where you're going to work from. You know, what are the options for that? We'll talk about that. Later on, you're going to be the one. You're going to be gathering all the facts, and you need to be confident in the sources. You may end up drafting statements for the spokesperson or for release by somebody else. And it's really helpful to anticipate what those tough questions are. And then as the economic developer, your job in part will be to keep the contact going with businesses. So it's not just a one and done. Next slide, please. Data. I know that Cynthia feels really strongly about data, and this is part of the reason why economic developers make such good spokespeople, because we have the data. You want to take over, Cynthia?
Sure. In our experience in economic development, we have to be ready to respond to so many different weird questions in a quick and accurate manner. So economic developers tend to have a lot of data. And we are lucky that a lot of the data we can collect ourselves, or we use other sources, but we can also buy data. And particularly in the business world, there are many private business databases that are worth buying, because they can give you very specific information about who's in your community, what are their characteristics, how many employees they have, how many other locations they have. And that can really enrich your ability to A, understand who's there, and B, reach out to them if you need to. In economic development, we also know where businesses are, and we know who are the key players there, who are the owners, or who are the tenants if it's a building they're renting. And that's very important. And I'll give you an example later on about how that played out for Arlington in 9/11. But to know what buildings might be impacted and who's in those businesses, who's in those buildings, really everybody else that's on the response team wants that data. And you are the ones that have the most current data about that. A lot of this data is also pulled together through CRM systems. In Arlington, we have a very robust Salesforce system. And what that system has enabled us to do is understand, collect, control, manage all sorts of communications that we have had with individual businesses or groups of businesses. And that's really facilitated when we have to get urgent messages out quickly, and also when they have to respond back to us. And I think that's fundamentally why we add so much to the whole during the response and then in the recovery piece, because we can actually reach out and target specific businesses and other organizations as the crisis evolves.
No, I would just add to that too. So I have been working in the economic recovery support function under FEMA and with USEDA after disasters to determine what the impact really was and what's likely to happen going forward, with supply chains and, different business impacts to industries. And I find that usually the most valuable interviews we can have are with the economic developers. You might go to the head of a county administrator, and say, what happened to your businesses? And they may or may not even know. I mean, they're focused on a lot of other things. They may be thinking about housing, health and safety, debris cleanup. But the economic developers are going to know, which businesses were hit. The Chamber of Commerce should be surveying their members and finding out what help they need. So, these are really good sources. Industry associations, if there's a manufacturing association in an area, been hit, flooded, do they know which manufacturers were impacted, how their employees were impacted? Or agriculture, there's usually a lot of good agriculture support agencies, and they definitely know what's going on.
Also, Lynn, and
Mhm.
if I can interject, in economic development, every service, government service and program and department really knows what they're doing very well. But economic development is the ones that have to pull them together. So we know who's, if something's happened in the water treatment area, we know who to work through to get permits quickly. And we also know which businesses are out there that are either impacted by this and need to be higher up on the priority list, or they can help contribute to solving the problem.
Sydney, in the next slide, which we can turn to now, I want to ask you a little bit about 9/11. You were there. I think you were working in economic development at the time, and you told me a story about how one economic developer got on the roof of one of the tallest buildings in order to communicate. Tell us a little bit more about what it was like during that terrible crisis you had.
Well, it's horrific, of course. The Pentagon is very, very close is in Arlington, right by the airport. And it's also very close to Washington. And when the planes were hit, we have a robust emergency management system, and there were first responders there very, very quickly. And early on, though, they realized that a lot of the communication channels were down because of the plane running into the Pentagon. So we had to help. They called the county, the head of the county, and the county manager put them immediately in with us because people were asking about how to reconnect and reestablish communications between Washington and the Pentagon. So one of the first things they asked was, we've got, there were buildings in the way, we couldn't do direct line of sight. So we had to figure out a way to get an antenna up so that we can then communicate straight into Washington. And of course, we have data because we know what buildings are in our county. We know how tall they are. So we know where the best spot would be to put an antenna. We also, because we know who owns the buildings and who manages the buildings, we were able to get with them very, very quickly and basically say, hey, we're coming up. We need to get access to your roof. It's got to be very, very quickly. And we're on our way. And of course, everyone was immediately willing to help. And so it actually ended up being our director who was standing on top of the roof of the tallest building. It was a 30-something story building in Roslyn, moving the antenna, talking with people who were saying, can you move it a few feet to the left to reestablish the communications? And what I think, it was a horrible, horrible time. But when you were able to do something that's totally out of your wheelhouse, whoever thought that would be part of what you could contribute in a disaster like this? It really is. It really made the following days. You felt like you were able to contribute. So that's my weird little story about 9/11. Of course, we had a lot of other issues at 9/11 when they closed the airport down. All of the businesses we had to figure out what to do with all of those businesses and help them. We weren't sure if that airport would ever be open. So it really was an interesting time to have to deal with these kinds of things. I know New York had the same thing, but your economic development people can come through.
Okay, next slide, please. So here I've got a story about this. So Emergency Operations Center, I think it's ideal if you can work out of there alongside law enforcement, alongside local elected leaders, so everybody can have the same information at the same time. I used to live in Saipan in the Northern Mariana Islands, and I was there when the announcement of the garment factories closing first came. It was right before Christmas, horrible timing. The first of 34 factories to close happened to have 3,000 workers, and it was a company that I was a part of. And all of a sudden, you know, this announcement, we had to do the warn notice because of the number of employees that were going to be laid off in February, 3 months ahead. And all of a sudden, we dealt with these multiple crises. So we had a hostage situation where a bunch of workers took executives of the factory and locked them in a conference room for a couple of days. We were worried about their safety. We had workers striking. 400 workers walked to a resort hotel, which we also owned, and went through the lobby, and we're looking for the president of the company, and we're ready to tear apart that hotel. We have workers going to the nearest bank, which is Bank of Hawaii, and the bank was very worried about a run on the bank right before the holidays. I was assigned to work on a number of those incidents, and I was dealing with, you know, public officials, public safety, the FBI, the bank vice president, the hotel general manager, et cetera. And every day we would go early in the morning to the emergency operations center. We had set up sort of a war room, conference room, where we would talk about what was happening in different places, what kind of help we needed, what issues we expected. We would do these meetings twice a day, in the morning and end of the day, so we could all keep everybody informed and figure out what was the right information to put out to the public. And by doing this and working together, we were able to avert really serious situations from happening. Next slide, please. I'm going to put this back to Cindy, but I think I've been in this situation before where all of a sudden you need to know how to contact people. That bank vice president, what is his cell phone number? What's his home phone number? So I can warn him that 400 workers are coming to his bank to pull out all of their savings. You know, it's not, in the middle of a disaster is not the time to start trying to figure out who to contact. You need to have that information readily at hand. Cindy?
Well, and this is exactly where a good customer relationship management database, a CRM, is really fundamental. And we use Salesforce, which is very dynamic, and it's expensive. But even a smaller version is so vitally important. And what I think the other thing you can do as well is make sure you have, if you can't have relationships with everybody, make sure you have relationships with people who have specific relationships in the community. As Lynn mentioned, you know, the Chamber of Commerce has a list of their members. There are other business associations that have a list of their members. Commercial buildings have a list of their tenants that are in there. They can get with their tenants quickly. Same with retail centers. So it's very important that if you can't maintain your own list, you know who has the list. And people will hoard their lists and until there is a crisis. And then they realize how important it is that the people who know what's going on contact them, because they're being contacted by their members wanting to know what's happening.
Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit about controlling the message. Obviously, misinformation is harmful. And, you know, rumors will start, people will talk, and misinformation can spread like wildfire. So it's important to get ahead of the story, find out all the facts, and put out timely and accurate information. If you know, usually in any community, when reporters are covering a big story of a major event, they have to come up with a story every single day. And they're going to find something. So it's good if you control the message and you can get the information out ahead of the rumors. And, this may require a team effort where you have different people feeding information in that can be used for statements. Next slide, please.
Well, also, Lynn, just real quick,
Uh-huh.
if one of the things I think is really important too is knowing your community and knowing who are the groups that may be different cultural groups, different languages, different approaches to problem solving. And so keep an eye on that as you start developing these messages and responding to these messages, because that can go sideways so quickly, unintentionally.
I agree. Next slide. So, having a spokesperson who is somebody that people trust and preparing them and giving them the information, they may not have the time to be that one that goes out and researches everything, but you can get the information for them. And being consistent and consistently accurate will help rebuild the confidence. And I think, you don't want anybody in the organization talking. You want to enforce the rules. Who has been designated and what is the right procedure? Now, you don't want to get locked up in that to the point where nobody says anything. But that's why it's good, to have a spokesperson that's ready, that is somebody that you trust, that has been designated, that has the authority to speak. And that person is not going to go off on tangents and giving opinions. They're really going to give the right story. Next slide, please. So this is kind of where the rubber really meets the road. If you have a crisis, obviously you've got to gather the facts, but then start thinking, okay, what are the worst questions? What, if they ask this and they really don't want to talk about it, what are you going to say? You don't want to say no comment. You don't want to, you also don't want to play favorites with certain reporters. You may be more comfortable with somebody than another, but you need to really think through the topics. And this is where it's helpful to have a team that brainstorms. So when I was working for that large company out in the West Pacific, the team would typically be me, maybe the president or CEO, somebody from our legal department, and we would think through. And honestly, we had some terrible things. We had an accident with an elevator. Somebody was actually killed by an elevator, and horrible story. But we wanted to deal with it responsibly. We had to deal with it. I mean, it was obviously an OSHA case at that point, and we wanted to talk about what our safety measures were. So we practiced what are the tough questions, and we had standby statements. So we weren't going to put out publicity about this incident, but if the media did get a hold of it, or if even some legislator that wanted to give us a hard time, and we had some of those, what's your answer to this? We had practice and we had responses. And this last point on here, I call this must-bear points. Anybody who's ever gone through media training would understand this. The concept is that you develop some things that you want to say no matter what. These are your must-bear points. So these may be positive points about what you're doing about the situation, or things you really want the public to know. If you have these things in mind, if you have them in front of you, chances are much better for you to lead the interview rather than have the reporter go in all the directions they want to go, which could be negative. So I usually develop like 3 to 5 must-bear points that I've memorized that are going to, tell the truth about the situation and be a bit more positive about what we're doing about it. Next slide, please. So here are some things that you can talk about that would be good to talk about. So first of all, a lot of times disasters focus on health and safety, but we suggest it would be a really good public service to let people know what's happening to the economy as a result of the crisis. with COVID, obviously that affected everybody, affected every business, some businesses more than others. And I think it was really important to show empathy to what was going on with the businesses. So explaining the impact and the additional costs that businesses were going through to deal responsibly with the pandemic. Publicizing milestones, don't just accept all the bad crisis publicity, but publish when things are happening positively. I see, I've been working in Kentucky pretty much all year on the disasters that happened there, the tornadoes in last December, and then more recently in July, there were floods. And one of the things I think the governor is doing really well is putting out positive publicity about milestones, businesses reopening, money being disseminated to organizations, issues being tackled, and what kind of resources the Commonwealth of Kentucky is putting towards it. I think it's making him look very good, and I think it's really helping with people's confidence in the state. I also talked recently with somebody that went through the Joplin tornadoes, which was quite a while ago, and she was telling me another thing that they found with their community is to be ready for key dates. So anniversaries of disasters are a time when there tends to be more publicity. So to be ready for things like that. And then the last thing, if things are really not going right, or your community is getting a lot of bad publicity, or you just can't control it, you don't have the resources, I would consider hiring a PR firm. Cindy, do you have anything to add about this, these messages?
Well, I think I would, again, be very aware of cultural differences in your community and differences in language, and be sensitive to what their needs and how they understand various aspects of what's happening, what their potential futures are, and also work with your government, your community. A lot of people that are in other departments, people that deal with, for example, water treatment, they're not necessarily used to talking to people about things in the way you need to talk to them during a crisis. And so if you can have people tag along with them, so they can get it directly from the expert's mouth, but you're there to help them, I think that has really proven to be beneficial.
That's great. Next slide, please. Social media has really been, I think, a huge advance in crisis communications. A lot of times, when the mainstream media is down, Facebook is not. Text messages can still be used and people are still using them. Businesses are jumping on. Public safety can send out messages, Amber alerts, alerts to stay out of certain areas. It's a really good way for communities to engage citizens as well to track recovery. We're going to give some examples, but I want to move on to the next slide. So I was in Hawaii during the 2006 earthquake. This was before social media. And as a tourist, staying on the 20-something story of a building, and there was no information. Power was off for days. The airport was closed. The gas stations were down. The restaurants were closed. Couldn't even figure out where to get a hot cup of coffee. It was havoc. And so, as a tourist, it was just really a terrible experience. Contrast that to Puerto Vallarta, got hit by a very bad hurricane in 2015. And Facebook and Twitter and all these different social media platforms were just going gangbusters. And Puerto Vallarta really got high marks for how they put out information in this disaster. And it really, I think, affected their reputation as a good example. Next slide, please. Colorado had a bad experience. So in 2013, they had fires. And then because of the burn scars up in the mountains, when the rain started, they had terrible floods. And small towns got creamed. It was really a huge disaster, over $2 billion in damage. And the publicity went around the world very quickly, and it was going on for days that, for example, Colorado was on fire. And the local officials were just really afraid it would affect tourism. Obviously, it wasn't across the entire state, but it was certainly giving the impression that the whole state was in trouble. And as part of that recovery effort, the U.S. Economic Development Administration invited us to do what they call an economic development assessment team, which was to help brainstorm long and short-term recovery options and advice. I was fortunate to be working at the International Economic Development Council at the time, and I was invited to bring in some experienced economic developers who were volunteers to do a field visit. Actually, we did a couple field visits throughout the area, talk to local officials, figure out what's going on, and try to figure out how to get their economy going back on. Next slide. In this slide, these are just a couple of our recommendations. I mean, we looked at all the data, but one of the things we saw right away, especially as a tourist destination, they needed a very proactive, positive message that the state was in fact open for business. And it was not the entire state, it was just a couple small areas. We also talked about infrastructure being built back better. This wasn't so much about communication, but we saw that the resources that were coming in to deal with damaged infrastructure could be used to in fact improve it, and especially for the sake of business. So for example, there was a bridge that was always a traffic backup. We had that bridge in mind to come back with bigger capacity, so it actually would improve the business situation. We also saw that they were far too dependent on tourism, so the economic developers and local officials really needed to think about diversification in their planning for recovery. So we took a look at the community's assets to come up with some potential targets. Next slide. So moving to the East Coast now, and this is something you're familiar with because you had flooding in your area, but the Hurricane Sandy, gave the impression that the entire Jersey Shore was out of business and all of New York was affected. And there were, in fact, lots of areas that were completely unaffected. The state waged a very successful campaign to communicate that they were open for business. And that helped inspire a lot of businesses in the community to keep pushing for recovery and do what they needed to do to get back open. Cape May, which was my client at one point, was completely unaffected and beautiful. And they had what was at stake for them were the 12 million tourists they typically get every summer. So it was very, very important to get that message out that they were open for business. So this communication took a larger, bigger campaign. Actually, it was a national campaign. New Jersey Stronger Than the Storm was very effective. Cindy, I know you were involved in that disaster personally. Do you want to add anything here?
Well, our family house was basically at ground zero where the superstorm hit. And the island we live on, which is Island Beach, was closed for 6 months while they had to rebuild all the basic infrastructure, reconnect gas, water, and sewer. And it was truly a mess here. You would drive maybe 3 or 4 miles off. Once you could get off the island, you could drive, and really things were pretty normal. But Lynn, based on what you said in the last slide about sort of anniversaries, this October was the 10th anniversary of Sandy. And I had visitors, and we were driving down the island the whole way. And believe me, this is not Snooki's Jersey Shore anymore. They really, it's been built back. It's better, it's beautiful. Built businesses, some of the mom and pop businesses that were there in sort of crummy areas are still there, and they've expanded, and their business, they've changed business models. So recovery does happen. And having lived through this, it does take a long time, but it's if you haven't been to the Jersey Shore lately, come on down. Little
Okay.
plug there.
All right, next slide, please. So this is an example of using social media for recovery. The Kentucky Emergency Management has created a Facebook page to provide disaster updates and helpful advice. I've seen this in Missouri as well. In Missouri, they have one, it's called Missouri Flood Impact or something, where they have a Facebook page that's very active, and they put, helpful rebuilding strategies, safety information, businesses that are open, you name it. It's a very helpful way to get information out, and it's not as cumbersome to work with as a typical website. Next slide, please. In Joplin, Missouri, they had an EF5 tornado. It was very, very devastating. 161 people lost their lives. I talked quite a bit with the Chamber of Commerce after that event and asked them, what their role was. They took a very active role with using Facebook within 1 hour of the tornado to start relaying information and resources, particularly focusing on helping all of the businesses in the area. Next slide. I've got a couple slides here about Joplin. So some of the information, they not only did they have the Facebook page, but they also set up a hotline to combat misinformation, and they answered calls on all kinds of things. They had volunteers talking about utilities, cleanup, rebuilding, finance options, all kinds of other practical matters that were important for business recovery. Next slide. The Joplin Chamber rebuilt their website to focus on resources. So they did a very detailed business survey to find out how their members had been impacted. They created a tracking system for emergency grant funds, et cetera. Next slide. Polk County in Florida did the same. This was before social media, so it was a lot more paper oriented, but Polk County, the Chamber of Commerce and the Emergency Management coordinated flyers in English and Spanish on different recovery topics. Again, getting information out in a low tech way, but it was very effective. Next slide. The Polk County the Central Florida Development Council, it was made up, this is their regional planning organization, but they also have 13 chambers of commerce, which were providing information, and they would do daily updates. They were particularly concerned with fly-by-night contractors and, those people that just show up and they're looking for money and trying to take advantage. So they worked very hard to combat misinformation and publish information about reputable businesses. Next slide. Some of their updates, they also did updates on real estate needs. Sometimes businesses need to find vacant space where they can work, licensed contractors, business recovery resources. And again, they also used hard copy flyers and local media to communicate, radio, et cetera. Next slide. This I know both Cindy and I would love to talk about, but as an economic developer, not only are we providing information to businesses, but we are gathering information from them. And doing a business survey can give you a lot of information that you need about their needs and what's real for them. And taking that information and being their advocate is very important. You know, it's very unlikely that small business in particular are going to contact high-level officials, either if they're local or not. So you can be their voice. You can gather information that maybe they don't want to talk about individually, but collectively they would like to share. Cindy, do you have any?
Yeah, I want to add a bit here about how important a survey is, because that is something that your council, your board, the legislature, they will all respond to a survey in terms of they will believe when you can put in front of them, we have surveyed this many businesses and so many believe this and need this and that, they will respond to that. We've had so much more success getting the resources we need and the funding we need after we have done a survey. And surveys are so easy to do now. You can, they can be done on mobile phones, and many of the people you're trying to reach aren't going to have the ability to get into computers, but they all have their phones. And so that ended up being the most successful way to advocate for the businesses and to get the resources that we needed to support the businesses.
And I think also, when you do a survey, sometimes the organization that's doing it doesn't know the answer to the really hard questions. But if you have done a survey, you can then take that information to state and federal officials and ask the questions. Is there a resource for this?
Yep.
Is there a way to fix this particular thing? And as an economic developer, if I can find ways to help, quick wins or even long-term wins that resulted from a survey, oh my gosh, your credibility, your relationship with those businesses will really take off to a new level. If you can help a business fix a problem, they're going to be your friend for life. And so that's another reason why I like to do surveys, so I can find those specific things that can help. And I have one or two team members on this call from my team in Kentucky, and we talk about this one chicken farmer, a woman chicken farmer who responded to a survey. And it was so sad. As I was reading the survey, she said, I lost all my chickens, and I don't think there's anything that can help me. But it's a big loss. Well, actually, there was. The USDA has a program to replace livestock after disaster. And it was exactly for her situation. So, she was very happy when she got this information. We pushed it back through the Chamber of Commerce to reinforce what they did to help her by asking this question. So love to find things like that. Or I think of a mayor also that I met along the way in Kentucky that was dealing with a lot of debris after the tornadoes that had ended up in the creek. And it was very costly to dredge it out. And so we found a program that could be specifically for dredging waterways through the conservation area of USDA. So we were able to match him up with a solution as well. So this advocacy, this can go on for a very long time. So just make sure that it's part of your program to be ready to be an advocate. And if you don't have the information, be sure to ask the questions. After a disaster, a myriad of federal agencies will come on the scene with different areas of specialty, so you can ask them the questions and they won't mind at all. Their job is to help make sure that their resources are used. The next slide is actually our last slide, I believe. And so we have plenty of time for questions. and just kind of in a summary, this is what businesses are looking for. This is what they need to hear from you. And it's not just your businesses, but also, excuse me, your community in general. So they're obviously looking for empathy. They want to know that they can come to you and you will advocate for them. They want to know how to get back into their businesses if they've been locked out by a disaster. They want to know who are reputable service providers that they can go to, and whether there are technical resources that can counsel them, case management, things we've talked about in the other webinars. And, you know, if I could boil it all down to one word and only one word, it would be confidence. All of this communication is it needs to result in rebuilding confidence. You don't want businesses to move away because they feel like they didn't get the information they needed, or they didn't get the help they needed, or their voice was not heard, or that their leaders really didn't have empathy for their situation. So I think, you know, confidently talking and communicating continuously through the disaster and through the recovery phase is super important. And talking about your plans. What are you going to do to help prevent this from happening again? And what are you doing to make your community more resilient? Cindy, I'm going to let you have the last word before we take questions.
Well, one of the things that occurs to me, and Lynn, I love how you put this together, because I think you covered it from a lot of different points of view. And I believe one of the things that's key is that communication needs to be regular. If people can count on hearing about something, if they know that at the end of the day, they're going to hear that there's a new post on a social media platform, or that someone's going to get up and speak, that's really reassuring, because if nothing happens, people go negative so quickly. And it's really hard to gain back their trust. So it's very complicated. I've looked at some of the chat questions, and I wish there was a way to do this that applies to every kind of crisis everywhere. But unfortunately, you need smart people that have creative ideas and that stay in front of people and people can trust.
Okay. I know we have some questions. Josh Mitchell asked if there's a crisis communication toolkit or resource guide. Other than the ones that are just general practices on this topic, and I know this is a big topic in public relations. I mean, there are firms that just completely focus on crisis communications. So you could find some general, if you Google crisis communications, find some general things. But for economic developers, I would recommend you take a look at the website restoreyoureconomy.org. I'm going to put that in the chat here, restoreyoureconomy.org. This is a website that was funded by EDA through the International Economic Development Council. It's very actively maintained. A lot of case studies and things about economic recovery. And there's a publication called Leadership in Times of Crisis. I was part of the initial publication, which came out in 2014. And they just did an update in 2022. And there's a chapter, I believe, on crisis communication. So a lot of things we talked about here are from there. A lot of case studies, et cetera. Business data. Oh my gosh, there's so many business data sources. Cindy, you want to tackle that one?
I do want to tackle this one because it's scary how many business sources there are. It's scary how many of them you really need to know how they get their data, how frequently their data is updated, or is it is how it's what it means. How are they pulling it together? Things like a business list. You can get international data for businesses that will tell you, who's there, how many employees they have, where are their locations, how big is their, how big is their capital, all of that kind of stuff. And that's very good when you're trying to aggregate data together to look at perhaps, how a cluster is represented in an area. But if you're trying to get specific data for, a 2 square block area that's been damaged and you need to reach people there, that is harder than you would imagine. And so it's very important that communities keep that data as best they can. And some of the best ways of getting information about that are from one of the sources that does not like to share their data at all. I've never found anyone wanting to share this data until there's a crisis, and they will. And that are school systems. A school system knows where every child lives. They have their addresses. They may know other characteristics of the child's world, and they can be very, very helpful. And in a crisis, if you go to them with a very specific request, you may get this data. And it's, for security reasons, for obviously other reasons, they will not just sort of randomly give out that data. So be creative, find out who needs to know certain specific things, and then go to them and ask them specific questions about their data. One of the things we had when we were doing our big COVID grant program was we required that if you were going to get a grant from Arlington County, you actually needed to have a valid business license in Arlington County. Well, getting information about who's got a business license is very difficult in certain places because there's a lot of proprietary data all mashed in with the business license data. And actually, because we didn't have good access to that data, we experienced people that were trying to, that were attempting fraud on our program. Well, we learned that, and we learn now exactly what we need to ask for when we're asking for somebody else's data. And I think that will help you very much when you're trying to get at specific incremental ways of helping people recover.
Now, I guess I would add too, it just reminded me one thing is to respect confidentiality. So if you are being given proprietary information and you are pledging to keep it private, definitely do so. I've seen times when, we've been burned on that, where we had information about like how many people were going into a certain area and we were supposed to keep that confidential, and I saw it published. Somebody did not, and then our credibility to get that information again is completely shot. So if you do a business survey, for example, and you say that the information will be aggregated, definitely do not identify who said what. I was recently asked to identify who said what in a survey that was done through interviews, and we just said, no, I'm sorry, we cannot. We have to maintain the confidentiality of the source. So that enables people to talk with you with better confidence and frankly, to be more open. You'll get candid response if they know you're going to handle the information the right way.
Yeah.
Carla put another question in the chat. Carla, do you want to speak your question and what you're trying to get out there?
Sure. Thank you, Lynn. So basically, as I was listening to this excellent and super informative presentation, I was thinking about in the Mid-Hudson, We have the counties that during the recent COVID crisis did an amazing job of communicating with their communities. And the large population centers also did a great job communicating with their communities. But I was thinking that that there might be instances where there is possibly like too much overlap in the communication between the two. And do you have any guidance on how large population centers, the largest population centers within a county, should be working with their county, the coordination on that, and maybe even coordination with the state, as with COVID that impacted the entire state?
So just because an area is large, to me, doesn't mean they should take priority in being the spokesperson. I would say it depends on a lot of things. First of all, what are the key issues? You know, you may want to have experts in certain issues talk on behalf of, you know, what's going on. I think also sometimes it's a personality thing too. If you have a mayor who's really a good spokesperson and advocates for their community, they may be a better person than, say, a county administrator that doesn't have that experience. When we were working in Western Kentucky, we saw that there was one long-term recovery group, which was really particularly good. They had a lot of committees, they had a lot of active citizens, and they tended to put out a lot more information. They were really active on Facebook. They had a lot of meetings, so they were a good spokespeople for their region on different topics. It kind of also depends on the disaster. So in the collapse of an industry, you may want to have an industry association speaking. If it's a medical thing like the pandemic, obviously we had to have a spokesperson that was knowledgeable about the science and about the health issues. We couldn't just have an economic developer talking about it. So it really depends on what the disaster is. I think also there's a lot of differences between cities and rural areas. And it can be a real turnoff for rural people if cities are speaking because they're larger. So
Thank you for mentioning. Thank you for mentioning that about the smaller communities, the rural areas, because I was also thinking about just how small communities weather through major disasters, and because frequently the very small communities are the most capacity challenged. And this is just like another challenge on their internal staffing capacity.
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an issue. Yeah, capacity is always a problem, particularly after a disaster. And I've also seen situations where some of the people that would make the best spokespeople were actually personally impacted by the disaster. So they just didn't have the extra energy and capacity to deal with a public role. So they're getting at both ends.
Thank you. Cynthia, do you have any other thoughts on this before we move to the last slides? Oh, you're muted right now.
Muted. Let me, one of the things we have in, you know, you're a regional organization, so you know this, is who in the region gets to have the voice. And how different, when you have different jurisdictions that are basically all on the same level in terms of a hierarchy, whose voice gets heard. And sometimes, finding the dynamic spokesperson for the region is very difficult. So I hope you all in your regional organization are aware of that and have people, a stable full of people that you can pull and that can help you. Because it takes one person kind of going off the rails that can really hurt everybody.
Well, sorry.
I'll just add that I think the way I was able to articulate our economic issues in the Marianas and be a spokesperson for the big company I used to work for when we had a crisis, gave confidence in our local leaders. How I ended up back in the States is the governor asked me to be his spokesperson in DC, which was, hugely flattering that he knew that I could explain what was going on with the economy with facts, and that I wasn't going to go off, on my own opinions, and I wasn't seeking publicity. I was really, truly trying to get the message across about what was going on with our economic situation, and my job was to find help, find help from federal agencies. So I think establishing that credibility and keeping control over my opinions enabled me to do that, even though my boss was halfway across the world. So communications is something, it takes practice. You don't want to figure it out when you're in the middle of a crisis. So, I think preparing your procedures and your, how you're going to do it is good done in blue skies. So.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Lynn. If we could move on, I think probably 2 slides at this point. Move forward. Yes, great. That's where we are now. Thank you so much. So I wanted to thank you, Lynn and Cindy, for this insightful presentation on the importance of communications in a crisis. I have found it really, really informative and helpful, and in hearing the nuances that are involved. So thank you so much for that. And I'd also like to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar. The slide decks and recordings for all the webinars, the 3 that have been held, and the CARES project report on best practices for economic recovery after a crisis will be available on HVRC's website in the link at the top of this slide. Next slide, please. And last but not least, please feel free to reach out to HVRC's team for technical assistance and guidance on our various regional efforts. We thank you so much for joining us today, and best wishes for the holiday season. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks.